This is part 2 of the Thanksgiving Day binge of Season 10, You Killed Chris. Another hour and 45 minutes of Dakota Spotlight. Let's dive back into the story. Sadly, perhaps, Linda also discovered that Christine's dorm mates didn't really know Christine either.
Oh, yeah. Oh, I knew Chris. She was down the hall or I was upstairs and I'd see her walking through or whatever. She sure had nice clothes or she sure was pretty. And I go, yeah, do you remember anything else about her? I'd say, I'm trying to get together a memory book, that kind of thing. She hadn't touched enough lives. So then I started hitting on the church.
In Madison, Christine belonged to the First Church of Christ Scientist on Wisconsin Avenue. So Linda paid them a visit too.
And I started talking to people that were in her Sunday school class, people who I think they're called elders at the church and that. And I would feign a little interest in the religion. I'd say, oh, Chris, do you remember her? She mentioned this religion to me and I'm just looking. I was trying any kind of device I could use to just get myself into a situation. And people would say yeah, she was very nice or always very kind or so sweet or always very friendly and whatever. And I go, yeah, I'm really trying to find some good recollections of her because, precious moments for her family or for myself as one of her friends. And it was all kind of like in the clouds or something to me. There was nothing of substance to me.
Linda also spoke with various young men who had gone on dates with Christine.
She said, oh yeah, she was always so sweet and she was never jealous or, she'd encourage me to get a girlfriend or introduce me to somebody she knew and say, he's a nice guy, you might have something in common to go dancing with or whatever, because Chris loved to dance at the church dances and that. And that was the kind of thing. It was just like, I felt like nobody had that depth of relationship with her that I was trying to find out about, who had shared her life, really. It was very dissatisfying, really, at the end.
Throughout her remaining years as a student at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, Linda continued to track down Christine's acquaintances, classmates, and teachers. In the end, she had several notebooks filled with her findings.
Just like Sherlock Holmes, moving straight forward, but nobody seemed to know her and nobody seemed to care, and it was like nothing had ever happened. It was like, this was just all a figment of my imagination. It was never brought up anywhere, ever.
And it's just 5 minutes to the historic launch of the Apollo 11 with all going well. Astronauts Armstrong, Collins, and Aldrin sitting there atop the great Saturn rocket in their command module getting ready for launch. Here's Jack King in launch control.
Counting. Skip Chauvin informing the astronauts that the swing arm now coming back. The astronauts will have a few...
Does your deodorant wilt when you're warm? Then it's time you try Dial deodorant. The great deodorant protection from the Dial soap people. Just a spray after your shower. Concentrates what Dial is famous for. The most effective deodorant protection you can buy. Dial deodorant. It won't wilt when you're warm. Who else but Dial could do it so well?
It's a little shadowy, but he said he expected that in the shadow of the lunar module. Armstrong is on the moon. Neil Armstrong, 38-year-old American, standing on the surface of the moon.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
5 persons, including actress Sharon Tate, were found dead at the home of Miss Tate and her husband, screen director Roman Polanyi.
For the purpose of announcing that we today have concluded an agreement to end the war and bring peace with honor in Vietnam.
Once I was out of school, I stayed in the Madison area and I got my teaching degree just so that I could get near campus every weekend.
I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford, will be sworn in as president at that hour in this office.
I, Jimmy Carter, do solemnly swear
that I will faithfully execute
the
office of President of the United States.
During that time, I would write hundreds of letters, and I'm talking handwritten letters. I didn't like Xerox stuff or copy it on a whatever. I would write these letters like to everybody with a certain last name, or to everybody that was on a certain faculty or whatever. And I would ask them information and try to, they were short letters, but they were all there.
The winning goal as the United States defeated the Soviet Union.
I, Ronald Reagan, do solemnly swear
that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
I contacted the university hospital, and I wrote to the director, and I asked for a list of the nursing staff. And I got it, came in the mail.
There has been a nuclear accident in the Soviet Union, and the Soviets have admitted that it happened. And there is speculation in Moscow that people were injured and may have died.
I wrote to every single nurse that was on their staff and asked them if they had been there, part of the program regarding when Chris was murdered.
The East German government said tonight they were going to make more openings in the wall, at least a dozen more. Put bulldozers right through the wall so that more people could cross to the west.
I mean, I wrote hundreds of letters to different people, hundreds. And I would call and try to get my information, and this went on and on and on.
It spans the globe like a superhighway. It is called Internet.
It is a growing grid of independent computer networks interlaced. You need a computer and a phone, and suddenly you're part of a new mesh of people, programs, archives, ideas.
And with the internet, suddenly Linda had new opportunities. Finally, she had a way to potentially track down Niels Jorgensen, the oddball older man that had been stalking Christine. She wondered who he was, really. She wondered where he was and why had the task force dropped him as a suspect. She decided she needed to learn everything about the man.
So I started delving into Niels Jorgensen's ancestry, which was very limited at that time on, there was hardly anything there. And any of the last names in that I would pick up, and I would try to find them through the phone books that were at the library for every city and state. I just went on in circles. And that's how it basically went for a long, long time.
Linda had notebooks full of information. She decided to start a new phase of her investigation. She would interview hospital staff about Jorgensen and try to work with the UWPD. Because she felt that they should talk to this Niels Jorgensen person again, if they could find him. She wrote to every doctor on the 1968 staff. She asked them to contact her anonymously to talk about Niels Jorgensen, but it all backfired. She didn't get a single response. She wrote a letter to the editor of the Wisconsin Alumni Magazine. Her letter read, "On May 26, 1968, my friend Christine Rothschild's body was found in the bushes in front of Sterling Hall. She had been brutally strangled and repeatedly stabbed. A freshman resident of Ann Emery Hall, Chris planned to major in journalism and was preparing to return to her home in Chicago to continue modeling for the summer when she died." At the bottom of the letter, Linda wrote that if anyone had any information about the murder, to contact the UWPD. But she also gave them her own contact information, her address. And finally, a break. 2 people reached out to her. One person was Dr. David Quanbeck, who had been Niels Jorgensen's roommate during the 3 months he had been in Madison. Finally, in David Quanbeck, Linda had a source who could tell her more about Jorgensen. And so she asked Quanbeck many questions. Who was Jorgensen? What was he like? When did he arrive?
He came onto campus, according to his roommate, David Quanbeck, on the last day of March. And at that point, David Quanbeck was living with his girlfriend, Anita, in a 2-bedroom apartment where all the apartments in that little complex there were meant for medical students. And he had been lucky all year because he never had a roommate. And then he was gone on March 31st. And that evening when he was gone, his girlfriend Anita answered the door, and it was Niels Jorgensen saying, "I'm supposed to be living here in this apartment with you." And she was kind of flabbergasted, like, what? It's already late in the year. It's already the end of March,
And so, a bit confused and taken off guard, David Quanbeck's fiancée Anita showed Niels Jorgensen where the second bedroom was, and the man started moving in.
So he came the last day of March, and he started a 90-day probationary period on April 1st. And it took me years to find out how that happened, what led up to that. And Dr. Sanford Mackman, they call him Sandy Mackman, he said that he was in charge of 4 residents for 4 years. And one of the residents, for some reason, left the program. So there was an opening.
Well, here's the story. I was a young staff man at the university hospitals. I was in charge of the residency program.
This is Dr. Sandy Mackman. I interviewed him over the phone recently. You will hear another voice in this interview too, that of Mari Zoerb Hansen, who has assisted me with research on this season. We asked Dr. Mackman to share his memories of Niels Jorgensen.
In the 3rd year residency, we all of a sudden had an illness, and one of the residents had to drop out. So we normally have 4 residents per year, and we were short a resident. And I don't quite remember if we advertised the position or what, but all I know is that Niels Jorgensen appeared one day telling me that he was in the Foreign Service, I believe as I recall, in Africa, that he had 2 years of residency and that he wanted to continue his residency as a 3rd-year resident. He looked older, a little bit disheveled. He drove a kind of a maroonish Mercedes, old Mercedes. We tried to look into his background, couldn't find anything. But in talking to him, I thought at least he had some legitimate training. So I decided to hire him on a conditional basis. We were watching him like a hawk, and he had some strange habits. One thing that really upset me was that we did a lot of student health surgery, and a lot of the women students came in with abdominal pain, which could have been appendicitis, it could have been a pelvic inflammatory disease. And his evaluations of those patients was way beyond what a normal surgeon would do.
By that, do you mean like he was touching them physically?
Oh, no,
inappropriately?
No, it wasn't that. The history was just kind of bizarre. I can't say it was totally bizarre. It just was more than I've ever seen any surgical resident write down.
So he was questioning them about their history?
Yes, as part of the evaluation. But it just was heavy. It just kind of jarred me a little bit. I don't think there was abuse, or at least I could not prove any abuse or any of that kind of stuff. But it was just strange, much more different than most surgical residents would do in describing the abdominal examination to rule out appendicitis or a pelvic infection. And I talked to him about it. I said, you're a little over the top. So we kept on watching him, and there was nothing really more about it. And then I told him we wouldn't continue hiring him, that he had a conditional probation and that we didn't want to continue having him in our program.
Do you recall other concerns you had with him? You said you were watching him.
Well, yes. One thing that I do recall is that when he was hired, one of the radiologists said to me, Sandy, where the hell did you get him? He said, I was an intern with him. And he said, we were having a Christmas party in the internship, and some of us were writing a skit. And he says, Niles came into the room with a gun and kept on pulling the trigger and the bolt back and forth and said, I hope you're not including me.
This was at a different hospital, correct?
This was years before, maybe 3 or 4 years before. He said, this guy's crazy. He interned with him.
How did that conversation end? Do you recall what your reaction was to his story? Was it kind of
My reaction was, why did I even hire this idiot?
Did he ever physically threaten you in any way?
Never. Absolutely never.
Just weeks or perhaps days after Christine's death, Dr. Mackman and his wife hosted an annual end-of-the-term party for staff and residents. Niels Jorgensen was invited to that party, and he attended. It was his eccentric behavior at that party that night that first led Dr. Mackman and his wife to wonder if Jorgensen might be Christine's killer. The party was located at the Mackman home.
And Niles came first one there, and he came with a box, a cardboard box. Didn't say anything about it. Didn't say this is a gift or this is that. And he started talking to my wife, and he said he had a knife collection. Showed his hands how strong it was, also to my wife. And that evening, both of us said, could it be him? In retrospect, the night of that she was murdered, he was on call, got called, and didn't answer that call. The next morning, he came with a bandage on his hand. And I didn't think much of it, but in retrospect, we began to think about that. As soon as the very next morning, we called the police department and said, could this be him?
I just want to make a quick note here. In a second, you will hear Dr. Mackman refer to 2 books written about this case. One of those books is Linda's book. I just want to point out that the other book is not Kevin Damask's book, Cold, The Unsolved Murders of 7 Young Women.
The thing that was written that kind of upsets me is that I think there were 2 books written. Both authors said, I didn't report it because I wanted to protect the university, which was as far from the truth as possible. As soon as it entered my mind, that very next day we called the police department and reported.
Both books, I believe, say that you waited until September.
Yes.
So this party was obviously after the murder.
Was kind of the end. Yeah, it was the end of the year party. The staff changes in July.
But obviously after May 26th, if you had those thoughts of him, could it be him, meaning could he have been the person who killed Christine Rothschild?
Exactly. I mean, it never entered my mind until this thing about my knife. I have a knife collection and my hands are so strong. That he said to my wife. I spent a fair amount of time with Linda telling her the same story that I just told you. And in her book, she wrote that I delayed calling the police because I wanted to protect the university. And it really irritates me because we've had people in Madison who know me and who read the book.
Do you have any idea where the confusion lies there?
No, I think it would be simple enough to find out if there's still police records, because the day I reported it should be in the police records.
Dr. Mackman makes a really good point there. A lot of these details could be easily verified with a simple glance at Christine's case file. I reached out to UWPD to request access to those records, but was declined. However, I have recently received some somewhat encouraging information about all this, and I'm hoping those files may be available soon. Another doctor that was there at the time and remembers Jorgensen is Dr. Lou Bernhardt. Mari Zoerb Hansen met with Dr. Bernhardt at his home.
My career at the university began in medical school in 1959, and I graduated in 1963. I started my general surgery residency in 1964 and finished in 1968.
Can you tell me what you remember about Niels Jorgensen during that time, in those few months that he was there?
I really don't have a distinct memory of him, except to say he was an outlier. If you have 10 different residents, he just wasn't in the 10 different resident compilation. In other words, he was an odd duck. He's not one of the guys that kind of fit in, that you would discuss things with.
So there was something different about him.
There was something different about him. And unfortunately, I can't remember any specifics. He was the kind of, and I'm a people person.
Yes.
And I can go camping with the guy that I just met if he and I connect. I don't think I would have, for sure I wouldn't have ever gone camping with him. I might not have come back to be interviewed. But he was the kind of guy that most of my colleagues didn't really connect with on a visceral level.
When I was researching ancestry, there were a lot of people, not with the Jorgensen last name, but with a certain other last name in California. And I started writing to them. And I said, excuse the inconvenience of this letter, but, and then I tried to, and I never made it mushy or emotional or whatever. I said, I'm just trying to find a relationship to see if I can find this person or whatever. And I never mentioned Chris. It would just be, I'm just trying to find somebody from the past or somebody that, lied to the sun, And I'd say, if you know anybody, please, and I'd say, or I had this friend at school, and he knew a Dr. Jorgensen, and the family was very impressive to this person, and he met them once. I'd tell a story and just go on and on. Anyways, I hit goals. Somebody called me and said, "Oh, I'm the cousin of Niels Jorgensen." And it was like, oh, okay. And then she says, how do you know Niels? And I lied and says, oh, at UW. I said, he was kind of a loner, and I always felt sorry for him. So I'd always invite him for a coffee and, at the drugstore or at, a coffee shop somewhere. I just told my story over and over. And I tried to write it down so I could tell a correct story to the right person. She said, yeah, I'm surprised you would bother doing that because he was such a disgusting, malicious, nasty, uncaring person. That's the reaction I got. And I said, yeah, but maybe I'm just a sucker or a loner myself, and it just was something I felt was the right thing to do after my 12 years of Catholic school, And we kind of got into this little chit-chatty thing. And finally, after weeks and weeks of back and forth, be calling and, whatever, and she was older, and I think she was lonely. We started talking about Niels, and she said, she says, what seems strange, Linda, she says, we never even knew he was in Madison. And I says, oh, didn't you see him often enough? She says, his mother didn't even know he was in Madison. Then it was like, bingo. Oh, and then who's his mom? Who's his dad? And like, blah, 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 and it went on and on and on. Or she'd say, why don't you talk to our friend Jackie or Julie or Susie or whoever or Jimmy, and, they can probably tell you more. Gradually, I was getting into it. I knew about the family firsthand. I had gotten pictures of the family firsthand from relatives. I got a picture of the apartment where Niels and his mother lived. People liked me. When I was chit-chatting rather than interrogating. That went on for, I'm going to say, 4 or 5 years. I said to someone, I said, I really should talk to Niels. I said, I've avoided him all these years because he was so nasty to me last time. And, yeah, that's how he is, blah, blah. And sure enough, they had an address. So that was the start of another good thing. And this was all done by people innocently sharing what they knew without having not even an inkling that a Chris Rothschild existed in the world. I was getting closer and closer and closer to the true story.
Linda's decades-long quest to solve Christine's murder had some unexpected outcomes for her. For one, she became the world's most renowned expert on the life of Niels Jorgensen.
The years were passing, and I was learning more about his family. I knew every little tidbit about his mom and his dad and his brothers, everything else from family, and they'd send me articles and tell me stuff about what they knew about it.
According to her book, Murder on the 56th Day, Niels' parents were both from Denmark. They immigrated to the United States in 1919. Niels was born in 1925, and his younger brother, Soren, 4 years later. The family lived in California, in North Hollywood, and Niels' father, a dentist, would become world-renowned for inventing the Jorgensen technique of sedation for dental patients. He taught dentistry at Loma Linda University School of Dentistry. Niels would attend that same school himself, but he didn't follow in his father's footsteps. Instead of pursuing dentistry, he set out to become a physician.
From 1955 until Chris's murder, it's kind of a blotchy story.
In her research, Linda discovered that there were lots of gaps in Niels' history. In fact, a lot of the things he told people were not true in the first place. For example, when Jorgensen arrived at the UW campus and applied for the residency position, the staff there were unable to verify certain aspects of his background. Of course, Niels had an explanation for this.
He said, the reason that it's not there is because I was a medical missionary in Africa all these years.
As you may have guessed by now, Linda, in her persistent and dogged way, got to the bottom of this too. According to Linda, Niels Jorgensen was never in Africa.
He never had applied for nor received a passport at any time during his life. I'm 100% sure of that. Secondly, he had said that he was at a specific hospital in South Africa, and it turned out that there was a doctor named Larson who years later wrote a book about that specific hospital and that community between the 60s to the 70s.
And so, of course, Linda bought the book and she read the book. Then she wrote a letter to the author under the guise of wanting to talk about an old friend of hers.
It was another good person that I had to mess with, okay? And I said, do you remember my friend Niels Jorgensen? He was also a doctor there at that time. Do you have any memories or anything that you can share with me about him? And I sent off my letter.
A few weeks later, the author called Linda on the phone.
He says, I don't have any recollection of that guy, and I was there for 15 years. No, he was never here during that whole time frame. He says, it was a small hospital, and the staff was all very tight.
According to Linda, Niels Jorgensen's whole life was basically a sham and a con.
Oh, everything he said, from his military career to the fact that he never completed his residency. He never became a doctor, or a full-fledged trauma doctor.
Linda also discovered that Niels' American Medical Association license fees were not paid for the following years: 1955, 56, 57, and 58, 1960, 61, 63, 64, 65, 66, and 1967. And then, the same year he popped up in Madison, 1968, suddenly he paid his medical license fee.
He lied about his family, lied about his role in the World War II.
Niels told people he was divorced, although he had never been married. He told people his younger brother had died in the war, while in fact, his brother had died while scuba diving. Basically, from the years 1955 to 1974, when his father died, his family and relatives had no idea where Niels was located. After his father's death in 1974, Niels moved back in with his now 86-year-old mother. He convinced her to sell her plush home in North Hollywood and to purchase them a 2-bedroom apartment in Marina del Rey, California. In her search for the truth about Niels Jorgensen, Linda left no stone unturned. When she learned through a friend of Jorgensen's that Niels often bragged about being a big shot around Marina del Rey and a VIP at a restaurant in Los Angeles, Linda looked into that too.
I contacted the owner of that place, and I talked to him about my good friend because I said I might like to do a party there since he's so popular there. And I says, I'd like to have a party for him and surprise him. And he says, I know my regular customers. He says, believe me. He says, I know everybody. And Niels Jorgensen did not exist on his list in any shape or form by name or description. His whole life was just one big lie. He had no reality. He was such a failure and everything. He created his own reality and lived in the glitter of that false reality. There was nothing about him at any time that was ever true. It was basically always Niels Jorgensen in some shape or form, but it wasn't Niels Jorgensen. It wasn't him.
40 years after the murders, Linda had learned a lot about Niels Jorgensen, but she had never spoken with the man.
After 40 years, I decided I have to do a memorial for Chris. I planned the memorial. I had to go through the chancellor and everything, and everybody was cooperative.
The memorial was to take place on the campus by the Carillon Tower, which had been one of Christine's favorite spots at UW. Linda even arranged for music to be played in the tower during the ceremony.
And I contacted all the press, television, radio, newspaper, everything. I had everything lined. My ducks were all in a good row.
And then, leading up to the event, Linda came up with an idea. It may seem like an odd idea, but in her own way, Linda was constructing a deceptive plan to get Jorgensen to hopefully incriminate himself in Christine's murder. She wrote a letter to Niels Jorgensen
about the memorial, when it was and everything. And I said, the only thing missing is you. I says, I'd like to invite you to be the keynote speaker at the memorial. I said to him, you're the best person to talk since you murdered her. I wrote that in the invitation. I said, you murdered her, so you know you've got the most you can say about all this.
In the letter, Linda included her address and phone number. She asked for a prompt answer so that she could plan accordingly for her keynote speaker. A few days later, Linda came home to 8 messages on her answering machine. In the first 7 recordings, the caller had simply hung up without saying a word.
I thought, oh, God, what is this? Finally, there was somebody who, after all these hours of hang-ups, left a message, and it was Niels Jorgensen.
Linda was eager to call Jorgensen on the phone right away, but her husband advised a different approach.
Get your thoughts together on this before you talk to him, so it might be the only time you get to talk to him. So I waited until the next evening after I spent the whole day just slaving over my questions and how I would speak to him. I thought, I have nothing to lose on this. You know, what can I lose?
And so Linda called up Niels Jorgensen, the man who had just received a letter from her, a letter that said, hey, since you killed Chris, why not be the keynote speaker at her memorial on the 40th anniversary of her death? As soon as Linda was on the phone speaking with Jorgensen, she felt confident she was talking to Christine's killer. To begin with, he didn't react in a way a normal person would after receiving a letter like that. As Linda says, what she was expecting him to say was something like this.
Are you some crazy person? And if so, tell me who you are so I can report you? How dare you even insinuate that I'm familiar with this horrendous crime?
But that's not what Niels Jorgensen had to say.
First off, he says they'll probably, and he was laughing, he said they'd probably arrest me before I even get off the plane. And he says, and secondly, are you going to pay all my expenses?
Linda told Jorgensen very matter-of-factly she would not be paying for his expenses.
He says, you got a pencil and paper? And he was real condescending to me. He says, I have a message for you for Dick Josephson.
Now let's recall who Dick Josephson is. Dick Josephson was a detective who worked on this case. We met him in an earlier episode. Today he's 90 years old.
I remember Christine, and I have always wondered, who for sure actually killed her.
Niels Jorgensen met Dick Josephson in September of 1968, when the task force flew first to Detroit and then on to New York to question him about Christine's murder. According to one news article, the task force from Madison interrogated Jorgensen for 4 hours one day, and then later they wanted to re-interview him again. But by then, Jorgensen was no longer cooperating.
When we went to talk to him, it was very short, and then he wanted to leave, and of course we had nothing to say he can't, so the next thing we know, he declined the polygraph. And after that, UW took over. So I don't know what, if anything, they did after that.
And here it was now 40 years later, and according to Linda, she was talking to Jorgensen on the phone, and Jorgensen was dictating a message to Detective Josephson.
And I took down the message verbatim, how he wanted to tell Dick Josephson what a dumb hick cop he was and how he couldn't solve the case because he was too stupid and he was too dumb to check for the murder weapon in the autoclave at University Hospital. And then he had me read it back to make sure I had it right because I was just a dumb person. I says, why don't you call him? I'll give you the number. He says, you call him. And he said, and call him soon, it was basically. And that was kind of the end of the conversation. And so I contacted Dick Josephson the next evening, and I gave him his message from Niels Jorgensen. But I learned one thing quickly. I understood, first of all, he was in control of the conversation because he had no interest in chit-chatting or saying, who the heck are you, or what is this about? Nothing. He knew what it was about. I knew what it was about. It was a matter of he had a thought in his mind, and the only important thing to him was controlling that it was conveyed as he directed.
So Niels Jorgensen did not attend the memorial that was held for Christine 40 years after her death. In her book, Linda claims that a man approached her at the memorial and introduced himself as a former university police officer. He said that he was one of 2 cops that Christine Rothschild had spoken with on Bascom Hill when she had wanted to report Jorgensen's harassment of her. Oddly, there was no real explanation why he had not spoken up about this sooner in his life, and allegedly the former cop attempted to contact UWPD after the memorial to now, 40 years later, tell his account of meeting Christine and her concerns about Jorgensen. Linda says this man was dismissed by WPD as, quote, a nutcase. In fact, over the years, Linda and UWPD have not seen eye to eye. For example, several times Linda attempted to get cold case television shows involved in the case, but she needed UWPD's cooperation for that, something she claims she just never got.
They were all very enthusiastic and more than interested in Chris's case, but they said, we have to have UWPD involved in these episodes. We have to. And they would not even return her calls. It was always this kind of thing where I would pique somebody's interest and I would get somebody who had a connection with somebody very important in this or that. And they would be more than willing to talk to me, and they did. And then they'd say, now, Linda, in order for us to go a step forward, we have to have a contact at UWPD, and there has to be their consent for participation. And it always went to 0. It was kind of a dry end.
This is probably as good a time as any to tell you about the death of Niels' younger brother, Soren. At the time, Soren was 20 years old and Niels was 24.
He probably was responsible for the death of his own brother through jealousy.
Soren died while scuba diving off the shore of Santa Catalina Island. Linda states in her book that there was suspicion that Niels, who usually accompanied his brother on these boating trips, somehow had sabotaged Soren's scuba gear, causing his death.
for which his parents never forgave him, but his mother especially was just totally hate. His father got withdrawn, but his mother became hateful and disgusted and verbal. She also became alcoholic.
Although Niels did not attend that memorial on the 40th anniversary of Christine's death, Linda continued to correspond with him. By this time, Niels' mother had passed away, and Niels lived alone in the 2-bedroom apartment in Marina del Rey, California. Linda's contact with Jorgensen at that time could probably be categorized as harassment in a court of law, and yet Niels never reported her or made any official complaints. Every year she wrote him letters, she made calls, she sent him Valentine's cards, and she didn't beat around the bush. She communicated with Jorgensen in a manner that matter-of-factly acknowledged him as Christine's killer. She did this intentionally in an attempt to manipulate his narcissistic personality in the hopes that he might incriminate himself someday or reveal information that only the killer might know.
I could certainly say that I was flippant about her death when I talked to him about it, and that I would make like careless mistakes in details regarding her death to see if he really knew or if he was just messing with me. I was happy with myself at the end, but it would have sounded beyond disgusting and shameful if you heard it. Like saying, oh, how come you stabbed her 14 times? Kind of a bad aim for a doctor, for a surgeon. He couldn't even find her heart. As horrible as that sounds, I still played all my keys every time, whenever I could. Really disgusting remarks. And those remarks were made knowing what I was dealing with.
Jorgensen did at times take the bait, and often he would correct those inaccurate descriptions of the murder, but he seemed to always stop short of a confession or fully incriminating himself.
I realized if you're going to deal with a psychopath, all he cares about is himself to begin with. And second of all, anything you think is immaterial to him, but he'll be so condescending, he'll want to correct it, which he did each time. And he said, that's not accurate or that's not true.
It seemed clear to Linda that Jorgensen was not going to slip up. What she needed was to somehow infiltrate his life even further. But how could she do that, short of perhaps breaking into his apartment and searching for clues? In the end, she didn't have to do that, though. She found a surrogate, someone who already had access to Niels' apartment and to his life. It turned out that late in life, Niels Jorgensen finally made a friend, perhaps his first and only friend in his whole life. Linda learned about this friend almost by accident when speaking with one of Jorgensen's relatives.
And when she talked to me one time, she said, Niels was here recently, and he was with a really nice guy, and I have no idea in the world why that really nice guy would hang around with him. And I said, do you happen to know what his name is? And she said, yeah. And she told me.
All Linda had at first was a name, David Dahl, so she set out to contact him. She knew she wanted to talk to this person, and once again, if she had to, she would deceive them into giving her information, all in the name of her dear friend Christine Rothschild.
I called Los Angeles, and I called Santa Barbara, and I called San Francisco, and I called a dozen other places, and I got every David Dahl there was, and I called every single one of them and left a voice message, or I called back till I got them. And I finally found David Dahl. That's the kind of time it takes, and it's so repetitious, talking. They go, oh no, my husband's David Dahl, but he's 98 years old, or my son's only 16, that kind of thing. And it's like, oh, I thank you. It's not the David I'm looking for. I'm looking for one that is a friend of so and so and blah blah. And I finally, again, hit the jackpot by finding him, and this led to unbelievable amount of information. I talked to David for a long time, and I told him that I knew Jorgensen from the University of Wisconsin, And I said that, he was kind of a loner, so he didn't have a lot of friends, and neither did I. And I said he was very abrasive because I wanted to make sure people knew that I really knew him, kind of. And I said, he's a hard guy to get to know, but I think he does have a heart beneath it all. And I said that, and he's a penny pincher, and this was all based on what I had known from other people. So he felt I knew him. And then he would start talking to me, because he had nothing to do. And so having a long 1.5-hour, 2-hour conversation with him was nothing. It was just like, I'd say, I'll call you in a week or so. And I said, we can, talk again about our mutual friend or something. And we'd laugh and ha-ha, and that was it. And we'd do it again.
Through her artful information gathering from David Dahl, Linda learned that his friendship with Jorgensen was based upon their mutual interest of hunting and fishing. And they were both lonely souls with no friends in the world, so it was kind of a match made in heaven for them. During her many phone calls with David Dahl, Linda continued to learn about the man she believes killed her friend Christine.
Niels Jorgensen, had 2 old cars parked in the parking lot there of his apartment complex that didn't even run. But Niels was a real penny pincher. He didn't really have to be, but he was, because he was living off of was left of his parents' estate. He didn't have a job. He never did, really. He would have his friend David Dahl drive him to these discount food stores where they'd sell dented cans and everything, way on the other side of Marina del Rey where they lived. And he'd say, hey, let's just go to a regular grocery store and I'll supplement your food bill if need be. But these long rides are ridiculous just for a few dented cans or whatever. Well, I guess that Niels was adamant. He wanted it a certain way, so David was very compliant.
Linda learned from David that the 2 men spent a lot of time together on weekends hunting and fishing, which is a sport that provides a lot of opportunity for conversation and getting to know each other. She also learned that Niels had fed David a lot of his lies about his past, something David seemed to have swallowed hook, line, and sinker. At this early stage in her telephone relationship with David Dahl, Linda bit her lip and did not tell David what she knew about Jorgensen's true history.
Yeah, he said he's told me all about how he was in the Battle of the Bulge and in an invasion of Normandy, and how his brother Soren died in the war. And my eyes are popping in my head. My mouth is as closed as I could hold it, because his brother was just a kid when all this was going on in the war, and Niels was never in the war.
At one point, David told Linda about the many hunting and fishing trips the 2 men took together. David Dahl shared a detail that immediately caught Linda's attention. While David claimed to only hunt and fish as much as he could eat and only kill an animal in the most humane way possible, Niels seemed to have a different approach.
And then he'd laugh and he'd say, yeah, but Niels is just kind of weird about that. He'll kill anything, and he says he'll kill as much as he can. And it kind of disgusted me sometimes how he would just enjoy those death squeals. And he said, like, if he's killing a rabbit, instead of, like, however you kill a rabbit humanely, if there's such a thing, he would enjoy, like, making it squeal for a little bit and then terminating it, that kind of thing.
And then, just when Linda thought there may not be a single bit of physical evidence left on the planet, anything that might tie Niels Jorgensen to Christine's death, David Dahl suddenly and casually mentioned something to Linda about his friend Niels.
And he says he has no fishing gear or anything of quality, and so I try to buy more or share mine. And then he said, but he's real crazy about that jacket of his. He says, I'll never forget that one night when he told me at the campsite, he says, yeah, I'm proud of this jacket because it has the blood on it of everything I've ever killed in my lifetime. Everything I've ever killed is what he said.
And so, of course, Linda immediately thought to herself, we have got to get our hands on that jacket. If Christine's blood and DNA is on that jacket, that would be a direct link from Niels Jorgensen to Christine Rothschild. Linda realized she needed to tell David Dahl about Christine Rothschild, about the murder, about Wisconsin-Madison, and her suspicions towards Niels. And so she told him everything.
He listened very calmly to my whole, and I said, and I do believe that there's a possibility that there is evidence, trace blood evidence, possibly on that jacket from Chris. I told him how she died, and it wasn't like he was taking it as a personal statement about his friend. This was discussed several times. The bottom line was he believed what Niels told him, and I think he believed me, but he felt like he'd been deceived by me in our possible friendship that he and I had developed over the phone. And he was more dedicated, of course, to Niels than to me. So there was like a line in the sand at that point.
Niels Jorgensen died in 2013, and David Dahl was named as the executor of his will. When Linda discovered this, she called David Dahl one last time.
And I said, in conscience, I would still like you to turn the jacket in to the police because you were the one that was in charge. You were the executor of his will, and you cleared out his apartment and sold it, and you took all of his possessions. So you somewhere have that jacket. Turn it in. That was our last conversation.
When there was no indication that David Dahl was going to turn in Niels' hunting jacket, if it still existed, Linda attempted to make the existence of the jacket known to law enforcement.
I had contacted LAPD to a homicide investigator, and specifically there's a hunting jacket that you need to be aware of in case, and I want you to know what I know.
According to Linda, the Los Angeles Police Department took Linda's information and then contacted the UWPD detective on the case at that time. Linda says that investigator was in no way happy to hear that Linda was still doing her own investigation.
Oh, I mean, she went ballistic. She must have told him I was like a crackpot and whatever, because I only got one more response, and that was to say that they had made contact with her. And they had been very interested in talking to me about the details of what I knew about him and about everything about him in Marina del Rey until UWPD was contacted by them.
To this date, there is no indication that Niels Jorgensen's hunting jacket has made its way into the hands of a crime lab. Linda believes that David Dahl is still alive somewhere. In this season, we have learned a lot about Linda Schulkel and her relentless pursuit of the truth about what happened to her friend Christine Rothschild in 1968. It's a quest she has pursued for decades, and as we have learned, her journey led her to a man named Niels Jorgensen, the resident surgeon who spent just weeks in Madison, Wisconsin, before promptly leaving town after Christine's murder. Linda is convinced that Niels is responsible for Christine's murder, and she is in no way alone in that belief. In fact, almost everyone we spoke to for this story had the same two things to share with us. Number one, they expressed great praise for Linda's work on this case. And number two, they feel that Linda's theory is most likely the correct one. Niels Jorgensen killed Christine Rothschild, and that they acknowledge is something that may never be able to be proven. Here is Sarah Surratt again. In 1967 and 68, Sarah lived just down the hall from Christine at Anne Emery Hall.
I have talked to Linda many times over the phone, over email, and yes, she is absolutely amazing. I just could not believe how relentless she has been in trying to get justice for Christine. I think Linda solved the case beautifully, with poetic justice.
And you will recall Dick Josephson, the now retired detective who investigated the Rothschild case, including taking a trip in 1968 to New York City to interview Niels Jorgensen.
You've talked to Linda, I'm sure. Yeah, and she's pretty sure it was Jorgensen, but my job as captain of detectives was proof. And I can't say he did or he didn't because I don't have any proof.
Perhaps you also remember Dr. Lou Bernhardt. He was working at the University Hospital in 1968, and he has recollections of Niels Jorgensen. Here are some thoughts he shared with Mari Zoerb Hansen, assistant researcher on this series, when she met with him at his home.
Somewhere in the 51 years that Linda devoted her life to solving this crime, she contacted me, and we began a friendship of trying to put pieces together like you're doing for the podcast. And I gave her, in any way I could, I helped her so that she could solve this crime. Because if you read the book, the different police agencies kind of shuttled it around. And if it hadn't been for Linda, this crime would never have been solved. Now, I don't know if, quote, it's still an open case. I don't say that in a legal, but it clearly, I mean, he was the murderer.
And like I have my opinions about it, but like in your opinion, why did the police, as you said, sort of shuttle it around in the way that they did?
I have no idea.
Yeah.
I have no idea. And every time Linda tried to, she was kind of shuttled around like, don't bother us. We got more things to do. Policing has come a long way also. Transparency in our world is much more. Accountability has progressed as time has progressed. People are held more accountable today.
Well, and would you also say that the process for screening residents is probably more complete than it used to be?
Oh, no question about it. No, I mean, there's no question about it. I mean, I don't know how Sandy, quote, vetted him, because Sandy is one of the most upright, honest, integrity without a blemish. He's just a fine gentleman.
And there are others who are in awe of Linda's efforts. Anna Hansen is a young reporter at the Wisconsin State Journal in Madison. She's been researching the Christine Rothschild case for some time now.
I mean, you mentioned Linda. She has been just such an incredible source and being so willing to share all of her efforts into this case. Like, I can't stress enough how incredible she is.
When I spoke with Anna recently, she mentioned something that will be helpful to understand in a moment when we meet yet another woman who has attempted to help solve this case. And that is that there was speculation over the years that a serial killer may have been in the Madison area, and some people speculated further that Christine may have been the killer's first victim. Here is Anna Hansen again, reporter at Wisconsin State Journal.
I don't personally subscribe to this belief, but, it's worth noting that people thought that there might be a serial killer in Madison because Christine was killed. And after that, throughout the 70s and into the 80s, a number of young female students were murdered on and around campus.
And it was partially because of those theories about a serial killer that another young woman got involved in this case back in 2011.
Despite how painful and bleak elements of this story are, I don't know, there's something really beautiful about how dedicated Linda has been to the memory of her friend.
This is Jill Clare. I spoke with her recently because years ago, in 2011, she had one long telephone conversation with Niels Jorgensen. It's a conversation you're about to hear. Jill lives in London. No, not that London.
London, Ontario, Canada. I have been here since 2008, moved here for school and fell in love with the city and just kind of never left. I have a undergraduate degree in information and media studies, and I have a master's degree in library and information science.
Jill is also the vocalist in a punk rock band. Here is a snippet of one of their songs, Arguing with Strangers on the Internet.
Arguing with strangers on the internet, not going out today because I'm feeling too upset. Arguing with strangers on the internet, and I'm winning.
During her third year of undergraduate studies, Jill was drawn to a course on campus called Serial Killers in the Media.
And the purpose was specifically introducing non-criminology students to styles of investigation, reviewing primary sources.
And Jill thought that sounds really interesting. So she signed up for the class.
The culminating activity for that was looking at an old cold case and seeing if you could come to a different conclusion than the investigators for who worked on the case. And sort of the theme running out throughout the course was the perception of serial killers, especially from the, let's say, like the 60s to the 90s, as public enemy number one created this kind of hysteria. So a lot of the time people would be like, oh, this is the work of a serial killer, when sometimes it was, but a lot of the time it was just, very tragic homicides that, because of this hysteria, people created this myth and linked deaths together, which was, what I would argue happened at the University of Wisconsin at Madison.
The project was a group assignment. Jill's group looked into several murders, one of them being Christine Rothschild. And even though this was before Linda Schulkel had written her book, it didn't take long for their research to lead them to Linda.
The most pivotal moment of this assignment for me, it wasn't interviewing Jorgensen. It was definitely getting in touch with Linda Schulkel. Stroke of luck, just happened to find an email address she was still using. So got in touch with her, and she was initially thrilled.
And of course Linda was thrilled. I think we all know enough about Linda's quest at this point to understand that she would be overjoyed that someone, anyone other than herself, was interested in Christine's case. But what Jill did not understand about Linda at that time was the incredible extent of research, the sheer volume of work Linda had put together. I mean, knowing what we know now about Linda, imagine calling her up on the phone and saying something like, "Hey, can you send me what you have on Christine's case and this Niels Jorgensen guy?"
She was like, just given the deadline you have, there's too much work that I've created to be able to send it along, and so that was almost the end of that.
But then, as Jill probed more into what Linda knew about Jorgensen, this happened.
And then she was like, well, I have his number if you want to call him. And I was like, yeah, you know what? I would like to call him. I was able to kind of bring this to the group and be like, what do you think? What do you want to do about this? And they were like, yeah, if you want to contact that guy, you should probably follow this lead.
So Jill started preparing for her call to Niels Jorgensen. She didn't want to give Jorgensen her actual name and identity, so she came up with a plan and created for herself a type of false identity. She would tell Jorgensen her name was Martha Shepard and that she was a student at the University of Michigan. She chose the University of Michigan only because she had a cousin there, and she felt she could probably pull off a cover story like that.
I just knew some very basic details about the school, just to kind of lend some credibility to this fake character that I had created. I remember going home one afternoon, it was the winter time, and knowing I was going to have to make the call, I had my list of questions. I think I wrote out 8 to 10 questions to ask him.
Jill also took steps to mask her phone number because she didn't want him to have it. In fact, she wasn't even 100% certain she wanted Niels Jorgensen to answer the phone at all.
I was kind of hoping, I was really divided. I was like, if he doesn't answer, am I going to have to call him again? Or is it good enough that I've tried? Also, was interested in talking to him in some way, just because how often do you pointedly, as a civilian, get to ask a suspected killer if they've murdered someone?
But Jorgensen did answer the phone.
The most stress I have ever had going in a conversation ever, even to this day. And the fact that he was home and that he picked up and that he was more than willing to talk to me, I think I might have been in a very mild form of shock. But, I really like Linda. I really like the person who's kept eyes on this case for, over 50 years. She did a very good job, I think, too, of prepping me for what I was in for. She was like, he's nuts, you know?
And Jill says the preparation Linda gave her helped. Jill was satisfied with herself on how she handled the conversation.
You surprise yourself when you kind of put yourself in those unfamiliar situations, when you really go outside of your comfort zone and talk to a narcissist on the phone.
Jill did record her conversation with Jorgensen, but unfortunately, she's unable to locate the original today. However, back in 2011, before the recording went lost and as part of her class assignment, she transcribed it very carefully. Now, naturally, I wanted to turn that surviving transcript into something you could listen to on this podcast. And I had a few options on how to go about it. I could read the transcript myself, I could hire voice actors, or I could use a synthetic voice. In the end, the synthetic option actually felt like the best choice, mainly because we have no recorded examples of Neil's voice. Recreating an accurate sense of him would be impossible. In my opinion, then, a synthetic representation is the most appropriate way of handling it. Sure, it sounds artificial and it's far from perfect, but I like the transparency of it. There should be no mistaking that this is not the actual voices of Jill and Niels Jorgensen. Now, before we dive into this conversation, I need to say this. In this interview, Niels Jorgensen is all over the place. You might call him unhinged. He rambles, shares random negative views on socialism, on women in general, brags about his wartime accomplishments, which, as far as we know, are lies. He even gets into disparaging Bill and Hillary Clinton and talks about hippie twin nurses. As I said, he's a bit all over the place. I suggest that as you listen to this conversation, try not to feel too distracted or frustrated if you can't quite follow along with what he's saying all the time, because that is the reality of it. You should be confused because he is confusing. I did consider editing out portions of the conversation, but in the end, I think many of you will be fascinated by this. That said, if you've simply had enough of Niels Jorgensen at some point and want to scroll forward in this episode, the conversation ends at about the 47-minute mark. Anyway, without further ado, let's listen in on this recreated 2011 conversation between Jill Clare and Niels Jorgensen.
Hi there. I was hoping to speak with Neil Jorgensen this afternoon.
Who's calling?
My name is Martha Shepard. I'm a student at the University of Michigan.
Yes?
I am doing a project on the Capital City murders, and I was wondering if wouldn't mind answering a couple questions for me to help me with my project.
Capital City murders? Is this someone shooting students from a tower or something? Or what?
Well, the Capital City murders were a couple of deaths which occurred to young women on the University of Wisconsin at Madison between, I think it was like 1965 to like 1987, something like that.
I was there briefly to get a chance to be chief survey resident, but I left because the politics at that school were so rotten that I left and got my chief residency somewhere else.
Okay, I
didn't get to socialize much. I was very busy, and I had some really, really big personal problems among the big professors. I really didn't get to know the students. The people I got to know were graduate students, and that's about it.
I understand that you are suspect in one of these
That's because of a not jealous, I'll say invective surgery chief who I exposed to be negligent in his duties. I had a patient which I was watching with the chest surgery chiefs, and I called him to let him know that the patient's blood pressure was dropping, and his systolic pressure was falling below numerically. That's the pulse rate. Oxford's rule of shock, ma'am, was an intern oxygen at Children's Hospital in New Orleans, and I notified this guy, and he was miffed that I bothered him at a party. Well, guess what? The next day, the diagnosis was of this patient. Rigor mortis. And I embarrassed that son of a bitch, Smart Alec, and he took upon himself, who didn't know anything about student affairs, even less than I, and dropped my name as a suspect. And that was just particularly vindictive, as I exposed him as an arrogant son of a bitch, who I exposed him for what he was, whereas I did my duty and informed him.
How come you've never cleared your name then?
I didn't have to clear my name. I did have an FBI because I have certain connections when I was Sergeant Major of Air Force Headquarters. That's how I cleared my name, because I was actually with a couple of student nurses who came over to see me and took me back to their abode, and I made an illegal turn in an illegal park. I went straight down the street to their place, dropped them off, made an illegal U-turn, came back to my place, and I was in no way there, and I wasn't. My name was cleared, but it was Federal Bureau of Investigation, and I was involved in some other things, namely espionage overseas, and I was making reports as a medical missionary to the CIA. So this is a matter that embarrassed the idiots off the socialist and the socialist mind on campus who seemed to think that Christian missionaries were like Elmer Gantry, hypocrites. Whereas the hypocrites are the socialist alias communist in the student body, which had taken over some of our best colleges in the country: Harvard, Yale, UCLA, and Stanford and Berkeley. And that's under the dominant theory of education, which took place in the 1890s in this country, and we have some of our own worst enemies right among us. The socialists masquerading as Democrats.
Were you familiar with Christine Rothschild at all? Did you have any relationship with her?
I never met her. I might have seen her. She might have made a spectacle of herself at the restaurant across the street from the university. We heard about her. I didn't even know her name until some years later. And in fact, we have some obsessive-compulsive neurosis on the part of somebody else who really made it a career, even sent me a DVD delineating that there was in this Rothschild person's home area a serial killer. She seemed to have forgotten a little about that. Furthermore, if she wanted to go into it, I never even dated teenage girls when I was in high school because I found something much better. One of my track associates in our 5 high school, he introduced me to his cousin Amalia in San Fernando, who was 19 years of age. I was only 15, shot up tall for a 15-year-old. She was such a wonderful girl that a lot of the girls who wanted to date me too, I said, "I'm sorry, I've got somebody else." So I never even dated any high school girls because I found older women and I found them much more valuable. So the thought that I would even date these teenagers, which I've never done, that's ridiculous. They would bore the hell out of me. And I had no time for them, and I was very busy. The surgery department was mismanaged, and you can imagine how it went. Through the surgery department with Dr. Hickey was thusly addressed by his surgery resident, that his chief surgery resident, Marvin Steinbeck, I think his name was. "But Marvin, why didn't you stop me?" "But Dr. Hickey, I thought you knew what you were doing." This conversation had been rickety-rocketing all over the campus, and it wasn't too long after that Dr. Hickey had to resign, and Dr. Curary, who was my surgical medical team, took over as chief surgery and chief professor. How do you like that for some interesting stuff that was going on?
That is pretty interesting.
Yeah, and then we have also Dr. Quack, who was the second chief of chest surgery, he didn't even speak to the real chief, the head chief chest surgeon, the one that spoke my name, because I exposed him as being an arrogant little neglecter of duty who cost a patient his life because he should have had a transfusion. And I notified him in good time the night before, when his blood pressure was dropping and his pulse was rising according to Oxford's rule of shock. So I was a political inconvenience. I did my job, and he did not. And now you have some insider politics. However, senator of Sam Hayek College, professor at the University of California, and a senator of California, and he said, "Come back to academic politics." What we thought were politics, but there was only one. And if there are any group of politics which were even worse, is church politics, because you expect to learn much more about them. So how do you like them apples?
How do you feel about the way these cases were handled?
The small-town cop mentality played to their political advantage to some of the professors at the University of Michigan. And I think that it's just sort of pathetic that these little cops are trying to have a job which is far beyond them, and then cooperating with others who are satisfied with some gritty explanation which didn't demand much mental activity.
I see. So you were pretty dissatisfied with the way this case was handled? Maybe
I was looking
with,
for to get a chief surgery residency so I could go back into the missionary field with better credentials, having finished the chief residency, because priests can be pretty snotty. And MRCS, Military Royal College Surgeons, I had an associate in Zululand, Dr. Anthony Barker, really a wonderful man. And I was going to come back to the mission field in Africa, but I got distracted by the mission field in the ghetto in Brooklyn. And I was at the call committee of the Diametic Society Consultant on Tropical Medicine. I didn't even know who this Christine Rothschild, but I did know some of the Rothschild family in Berkeley in the University of California. We used to go flying with Bertram Rothschild off the Rothschild family, South Africa. In fact, his father had preceded the stock exchange in Johannesburg. And when I was in Africa, I was with him. I was a guest at his home in Pretoria. I don't know if they knew the branches of the family, if this was even the same family, if this, what do you call her? Christine Rothschild.
That's right.
I didn't associate with undergraduates. I did socialize a bit at restaurants and bars and things with the professors and the graduate students. And I went to a few parties now and then. You know, when you're on every other night, you don't have a hell of a lot off time.
Absolutely.
And then there was this very hostile competition to get chief surgery residency, but about as popular as Leonard Field's Hannesteeth. Find something like that at a good university, you know. It will give you good credentials, you can finish up, As a matter of fact, there was even some doubt about University of Michigan. They had nationally a good reputation, except they had very severe problems intramurally. You can look up some interesting stuff there on this DVD that this little lady she's really an obsessive compulsive neurosis, and it's a shame that she puts so much of her life on a much false trail set out by this vindictive professor who I exposed for not doing his job, and I just did my job. Let him, the patient was in serious threat, and he did nothing.
Do you know the name of this obsessive-compulsive woman?
What are you saying? Look, I have artillery damage from artillery during World War II, and I don't hear everything very well. What did you say?
I apologize. Do you know the name of this obsessive-compulsive woman who's been keeping in contact with you?
Yes, I could have her prosecuted for harassment in the mail, but I didn't. Just hold on. Ms. Linda Shulko. She's a pathetic individual who wasted a lot of her time and possibly a lot of the truth. Multiple serial killers, followed by misdirecting efforts, which I can't say it was the campus police, which I can't say, or the Madison police either. Small-town cops. Not to cast dispersion on small-town cops, they don't have nearly the situation or the expertise that they do in New York or in Los Angeles. As a matter of fact, I've been a consultant to the Superior Court in California, in Los Angeles County, for victims of violent crime.
I
Saul
see.
gave you Miss Shulko. She's a rather pitiable situation, which she developed through neurosis there, which has given her a lot of wasted time and misdirection. And I'm just about the last person who would be involved. The only students I had anything to do with was one very fine young lady who was a philosophy major. And she kept writing me for some time, but I'm afraid I lost track of her. Her name was Ayamara Krasts. I think it's a Slavic name, or Yugoslavia, or Latvia, or Lithuania, or one of those countries. When I heard that some student was damaged, I was worried about Ayamara because she took long bicycle rides at night and was always meticulously dressed in white trousers and jacket and everything, and she wrote me these long letters telling me about her philosophical problems. She had very neat penmanship. I don't know what the potential might have been of this Christine person, but she's a person I never met, and I've never met this Linda Shulko.
Oh, I see. Well,
Is this a name are you familiar with this person?
I think I've seen Miss Shulko's name a couple times.
I beg your pardon? What did you say?
I think I've come across her name a couple times just while I was researching the victims for the Capital City case.
Spoke with several victims? Otherwise, was this the serial killer thing that was an adjacent caddy from which Miss Rothschild had come originally?
That's right. She's supposedly one of the victims of this serial killer who was active in Madison from 65 to 87.
Well, there was something on the DVD, a referral to a serial killer in a different county. Adjacent county, I guess it was. And they took about several victims, but I only heard about this one person who was a similar name to my friend from Berkeley, the real Rothschild family, the international financiers. Interesting thing came about from one of my friends who was on a visit from Stanford to make movies out of popular people like the State Department and the Saudis and Arabians. Political movies. Dustin Honquest came to this country in 1830, bought a ranch, and there's a big air base up there named Lantequet. And when his father was in the Air Force as a colonel, he had about 200 replacements go through his unit. A fighter pilot hands you over to North Africa. And this school he was with, it was a country school hestered by a French cavalry officer. Of course, this was after the war had concluded, but interesting school. But he met some of the people who ran France and have for the last 1,000 years, and he built a group of so-called because of a hotel he went into. It's actually been the only strengths for money boys in the world for many years. In China, they're known as the Zhang Pei. Now, I had a girlfriend who I met at a penthouse party in New York, Zoe Chan of the Chan clan. The Chan clan was very active with the old ambassador of the old Tia Pen. Said he was like a big judge for solving family problems in the New York area. I mean, that makes the mafia look like tiddlywinks. They have international power you wouldn't believe. Anyway, I think came up that why did Napoleon lose as Waterloo? Well, it just so happened that Manso Ho Shi, who was in charge of the northern corridor at the Waterloo site, failed to enter the fray from the north. And that was after Manso Ho Shi had received a carrier pigeon from the northwest, from Rothschild's Bank of England. Interesting?
Very interesting.
So the Bilderberg group, or whatever you want to call them, had been at it for a long time. And I might add you of something else, of a group-based meeting they had of the so-called Bilderberg in New Jersey. I guess it was in Trenton. Guess who was number 121? None other than Hillary. And she's another hypocrite. She pretends to be for the little man, but she's not. She and Bill Clinton were tending their own nest. They even took silverware from the White House when they left. Did you know that?
No, I didn't. I didn't know that.
See, these are the things a lot of people don't know because they don't read. They get distracted by stuff like this pathetic Miss Schulko. Sometimes you just gotta take a big breath and realize she's wasting her time, maybe even contributed to failure to find the serial killer who was responsible for Ms. Rothschild and others. There were some radio programs on serial killers. Quite popular. 30 deaths on one of the late-night performances. I'm not interested in criminality. I'm a trauma surgeon and a WWD disabled veteran, and I've had some interesting positions and made some very interesting connections over the years.
No, it sounds like...
For which I'm grateful for having done this. But I haven't followed up with any prosecution of Miss Schulko because I think she's a pathetic result of dirty college politics.
I see.
I gave you some interesting things because remember the name of the chief of surgery? He was all gray-haired now, but Kararaya was certainly there. He was a string flower. He was pushing this new cancer drink, Black Flora Uroskel, and his henchman, Macman, who was a exploitation there. Big example of a hangers-on. He was doing whatever kind of work he could exalt position to Dr. Kararaya. That's a professor of surgery, which came after Dr. Hickey. Both those were screwing up in the operating room. And that just goes to show off because he was an ingrown product of the residency program at Wisconsin. And he made some comments about how I didn't close the belly the same as you. Well, hell, I had surgeons who put him in shadows, some of the best in the country. At Bellevue, Dr. Emmelhoman, who took his own residency staff into combat with him. When he was in combat there, I was slugging in the mud with people from the 100th Division, 399 Infantry. I was a heavy weapon machine gunner with a Brownie water-cool machine gun. I got frostbite putting antifreeze into my Brownie water-cool machine gun, carrying a 56-pound rock, track rocks, which is the job of the #1 gunner. The only trouble is that it's too heavy. That's 50-odd pounds for the barrel without the water in it. But that was a marvelous shooting gun. You could put 3 shots in triple stock if you're left-handed. Pull your finger off the trigger and you get 3 shots interplay at 600 meters. Now that's shooting, like through the eye of a needle. But the only people I've ever killed or might have killed were wearing the opposite uniform. And I never had any interest in teenagers, and they were just not interesting. They were boring.
Christine Rothschild was stabbed 14 times. Do you have any idea what would compel a person to stab a person 14 times?
Well, maybe she refused some boy back in high school or something, and he took it out on her. Sounds like that's an act of rage. You would really have had to have some personal relations to make 1 or 2 stabs, but 14. That's an act of rage, wouldn't you say? You don't have to have a PhD in psychology to figure that one.
She also had her gloves shoved down her throat. I was wondering if you had any opinions about that.
Her gloves?
That's right.
Hand gloves?
Yes.
That's bizarre. What is that supposed to mean? That she talks too much, or tells people the wrong thing, or exposed him? Maybe she had an aborted sexual venture with a guy and she made fun of him, and maybe he couldn't get an erection at the proper moment. You could run wild with your imagination on that one. That's pretty wild.
One of the hypotheses that I've proposed is that maybe she was begging for her life when she was being murdered. And that was a little bit overwhelming for the murderer, so it was like an act of rage within that act of rage.
I don't think so. I think begging for her life, that's a symbolism I think you take too far. I think we have someone here who's got it in for women, or maybe she further antagonized him. I don't know, I never met the girl. I don't even know what she looks like. I never met Miss Schulko, if that's her maiden name. I don't know if that's her married name. So, I have no idea. I never studied criminal law. My mom was a professor of law at the University of Copenhagen. My dad was a physics student who had another Neil, a classmate at the University of Copenhagen named Neil Bohr. I've seen some of my dad's archives to notes from Neil, and I originally spoke the King's English, because that's what my mother spoke. But anyway, my dad changed his major from physics to medicine and shipped across the country, stopped in Berkeley to see my uncle Sulfus, who was a professor of engineering at Ann Arbor, one of the founders of the American Concrete Institute. And he went to the Parnassus Street Medical Center at University of California in San Francisco. That's how I got here. I'm a second-generation Berkeley-ager, otherwise known as Berserk Ely. That's according to my Stanford friends. They always had jokes about the Stanford and Berkeley, but I guess you don't.
Well, like I hear a couple every once in a while. But,
Well, there's no reason having this one paired off against that one, UCLA versus UC, so on and so forth.
I mean, I can only imagine. Can you tell me where you were living in 1976?
1976? You mean in Madison?
Were you living in Madison, Wisconsin in 1976?
I don't remember that clearly, but that's 44 years ago. I have one thing in mind. I just finished my chief residency and getting back into the mission field in Africa. And I got into that mission field sort of by accident, and I was an engineering student before. And then I was going into Air Force headquarters as acting sergeant major off the Air Force. Captain Arnold Paris and the early field. And one of the other sergeants invited me to a Christmas service in Huck-Suck McCugal Cathedral in Paris, and I was bomb Lutheran into the Evangelical Lutheran Church. But they were Catholic, of course, but the message off the bishop at the Christmas services really got through to me, and I said, well, maybe I should try medicine. So I started taking biological courses when I went back to UCLA after the war. That's how that started. And my friend there was Sergeant Prank Zimonetti. He was a religious Catholic boy in the finance department of Air Force headquarters in the patrolling the fields in Paris and Pitoir, and from an old Italian family. He retired as a bank president in Grand Junction, Colorado, and I went to see him several times. That's how I got, not sidetracked, but I got diverted into the mission field as a surgeon. It was a sermon, have you done unto you at least what you have done unto me? And that was enough for me. I was also a ghetto doctor in charge of one of the biggest clinics in Brooklyn, Gates Bushwick. I had a Catholic doctor-surgeon also who was my associate there. We had a dozen doctors. Gates Bushwick is one of the biggest clinics we have, over 100,000 patients in our file. And then when my mom got a scratch on her gold Cadillac, how harsh, and she didn't want to drive anymore. So I had to give away my practice so I could get a private clinic in Mastiff, Queens, which I took over from Dr. Jacobson when he passed on. I actually had 3 offices in New York, including Stratford, 4 hospitals. I was a busy boy. Across the street, over the railroad tracks, was the Golden Dragon, where I went for my evening run and all the vampires and werewolves and stuff came out. I call them junkies. When I was late for the meeting, the monthly meeting of the Public Health Committee, they would say, "Oh dear, we've seen the last of Dr. J," but I would show up. I kept turning up for the meetings and so forth. Even though we were yearly losing doctors to the Knife and Gun Club, it was a dangerous area.
Yeah, it sounds like a very dangerous area.
But there I was for years, until my mom needed me and I gave away my practice so people could take care of the patients. Didn't sell it, I just gave it away. Said, "Here you are, take good care," and then I was never in residence in New York. I stayed in Pennsylvania where I kept my horse.
You had a horse in Pennsylvania?
Yeah, I got him off the track in New York. He was a Banniston Meadower, Triple Crown winner.
That's very impressive.
Black, 16-hand stallion. He was my real friend. I used to go down there on weekends. Singles Country Club, which was in Pennsylvania, Willow Springs, Pickering Hunts Club. I used to ride him during fox hunts, chasing them on weekends. Chasing foxes. In fact, we chased all the foxes out, so we had to import some more.
Well, Mr. Jorgensen, I was wondering if the name Deborah Bennett meant anything to you.
No, that's not ringing a bell. The only girl I remember, she was not a girl. She was a woman, very fine lady. Ramara Crass was a philosophy student, a graduate student. And in other words, the so-called hippie twins, a couple of graduate students, graduate in nursing, they sort of adopted me, I guess. I don't know why. But they'd come over, and I guess it was that fatal night they were over at my place, which is across the street, maybe a little bit to the west from the hospital entrance. And then to the east a little bit was a store, was a restaurant, and a lot of people sort of congregated there. It was nice to have coffee and a hamburger. Anyways, they were there. They fantasized themselves as being hippies, nursing hippies. They were very respectable persons from good families and all that, and getting their bachelor's degrees in nursing from the University of Wisconsin. And they were over at my place, socializing and eating coffee and talking, and I reminded them that it was getting close to lockup time. And I drove them back to their place, east on the main boulevard, between my one level, a bunch of apartments, a residence, and a hospital to the east, several blocks to the accommodations where they lived. And I just pulled down the wrong side of the street, no traffic, and then made a U-turn, parked, and in our parking lot. So there was a lot of people watching television. The late news, I thought I was pretty well covered during the hours of interest. There's 2 nurse witnesses and the medical residents there. So what about this vindictive surgery professor who wanted to throw mud in my direction because I exposed him for being a lazy, arrogant bum that he was? That's the problem with doctors today. They're not interested. They're not with a conscience anymore. They forget obligations imposed by Cassiopoulos, the godfather of medicine. In fact, I contributed money from my own investments when I was an undergraduate at UCLA. I had a dive boat, and I used to dive for this underwater constructions, underwater demolition, and that was a hobby I had, underwater medicine. I was a member of the Undersea Medical Society. That's one of the reasons why I was a consultant for Chief Kukenboak on a marine search expedition for Mozambique for Witwatersrand University in Johannesburg. We were there for 3 months, hunting goiter in Mozambique area of Porto Analia, which was fish breeding grounds in the Indian Ocean near the northern rim of Chicago, near the Mozambique, which, by the way, was having a communist rebellion at the time. That's probably not news to you. You've probably heard about that.
Did you ever move back to Wisconsin? To Madison even?
Never. The only interest I had there was to get my chief surgery residency, fulfill my board eligibility for the Board of Surgeons. And the only reason it wasn't working out there was because of the political unrest I encountered, and I got my chief residency in New York. Madison, Wisconsin thought the sun didn't set without Wisconsin, and I beg to differ.
About 35 years ago, a couple police came to question you, and you were ill at the time.
That was not ill. I contacted my friends in the state of New York, and these police officers were probably sent on their way back to the Midwest without a choice. Farewell party type of thing. Get gone, or else face prosecution.
Okay. Do you believe these capital city murders were connected?
What are the capital city murders? I don't know this local stuff. I had no interest in Wisconsin. I was just interested in getting my chief surgery residency, and I got overwhelmed by the local hassles there, and I left. And good riddance. All your backbiting little hassles going on and your incompetent handling of serial killer and God knows what else. You should have taken some officer from New Orleans or New York or San Francisco or something where they handle real crime instead of this, whatever you call it, police in Madison.
Okay. Well, I really appreciate your time today, and I have one last question for you. Did you murder Christine Rothschild?
I never even knew her. I have no reason to kill her or any other teenager. I had no interest. You'd have to be in a state of frag in order to make 15 or 20, or what did you tell me stab wounds it was?
It was 14 stab wounds.
14. Well, if it's 5 or 10 or 20, it's still too many. One good thrust would do the job, if you had the knowledge of anatomy to do it, you know? It doesn't take that much knowledge. Any good swordsman knows where to find a place.
She was stabbed with a medical tool, and that just makes me curious if maybe you have some suspicions as to who might...
Medical tool? You mean like a Humvee knife or something?
Yeah, like a scalpel?
An amputation knife? My own attitude was to try and avoid an amputation knife by doing vascular grafts. It preserves perfusion of blood to the limb and saves the limb. This I learned from my chief at Bellevue, where Dr. Neville Homan took his hole and stabbed during combat during the Central European campaign. Battle off the bulge, you know they call it. And he was doing vascular grafts operating blood floor, using veins for his artillery wounds or whatever else you could interrupt circulation and saving legs that way.
That's very interesting.
That's my chief of surgery at Bellevue, Dr. Homan. Great surgeon. Hell of a lot better surgeon than that Kerorian in Wisconsin, and a number of other chief of surgery at other places that I knew. The great professor from the Middleton School and Baltimore, John Hopkins, which many arguably say was the head of the surgery, even on the West Coast. Actually, first surgeon and chief at the UCLA was a plastic surgery professor before he came to UCLA in the 50s. He started there about the time I started medical school, a level under which, incidentally, was a religious-motivated school.
No kidding. So you had no contact with a woman who you are the prime suspect in the murder of?
Never did.
Never did.
This was all a vindictive gesture by a surgery member because I exposed him for what he was, a lack of conscience. And that's the reason results in the negligent death of a patient.
And that's the reason you moved out of Madison soon after.
I had been offered residency in other departments. I could also have gotten into their kidney transplant program, which was very lucrative. You know how many kidneys were being transplanted?
No, I do not.
There was a long backlist waiting for a kidney with the dialysis machines. It was a hell of a way to live. But I wasn't interested in that. I wanted to get back into the mission field. But for that, I needed a chief residency in general surgery, not in kidney transplants or plastic surgery or any other opportunity in Wisconsin. But I wasn't interested. It didn't serve my purposes. People never get that through their damn heads. What's so great about Wisconsin? It's the nation's icebox. Well, I had a lot of fellow Scandinavians there. So what? Actually, I have more friends with Mexicans than I did with the Scandinavians. My first real girlfriend was 19-year-old Mexican lady. She was a refugee from the communist Venezuela in Mexico. They were ranchers across. They ran. Amalia was staying with her cousin, Pedro Vorez, who I used to run around the track with growing up. I grew up to 6 foot and 15-year-old. Blonde 15-year-old looked pretty good to a pretty Mexican girl. Well, I learned the value of older women. I was 15, she was 19, she was no child. Wonderful family, actually. Big happy family in San Fernando.
Well, Dr. Jorgensen, I just have to ask you one more time. Why did you never clear your name for this murder with this woman you had absolutely no contact with?
Why should I bother?
Well, I mean, that's a pretty heavy,
Well, I didn't find out until I got a letter from Miss Schulko that they're actually a surgery department member who put a shadow on me. I got that in her last letter. Want me to read it to you?
Sure. Yes, please.
You know, I knew who the Rothschild family were. I used to go flying with Victor Rothschild when we were students at Berkeley. Then he suddenly dropped out, and I found out it was because he had an attack of malaria. This is not the latest letter, just hold on.
Thank you.
Interesting line of people. Dr. Hickey, Marvin Chienberg, the witness to Dr. Hickey's goofing on the operating table, Dr. Marquine and Dr. Carreri, all these campus people, and the hippie nurse twins. They were funny. They weren't really good hippies. They were not genuine hippies. They were not smoking pot. They were not doing all sorts of weird counterculture things. That incident in Woodstock. I had a girlfriend in New York from the Chan clan, professor of computer sciences at the University of Colorado. Anyway, greetings from Texas. It's in neat printed handwriting. You came up in conversation the other day. Remember you worked at University Wisconsin-Madison University Hospital in the 68. Anyways, it was your supervisor who turned in your name to Chief Ralph Hansen off the UW campus. You are a suspect in Christine Rothschild's murder on May 26, 1968. I'm sure you recall Chief Hansen sent 2 detectives to speak with you after you fled Madison. I was not fleeing. I was seeking my chief residency. If you ever want to chat about an old UW Badger, I didn't even know the name was Badger. I wasn't even interested in football. At Berkeley, I was in International House next to the stadium. You think I ever saw a football game when I was going to Berkeley? No, I went stock fishing or deer hunting. Anyways, Badger Day, call collect. It would be interesting to reminisce since we have friends in common. I don't know any friends we have in common. She's deluded, that poor soul. Happy Valentine's Day. Ha, what a joke.
Did she send you that letter this year?
Posted 16 February 2011.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for reading that to me. I think that's going to add a pretty interesting dimension to this report.
What are you writing a report for?
It's just a cultural studies class. I chose to do an assignment on a serial killer, and this one was just one of the first names which came up when I did a search for it, so I figured I'd go with this.
You could also, that Christine's case was never solved, and these jerks muddling things up with their incompetence, they were responsible in the case, never getting solved with misdirecting their efforts.
Yeah, I have read that. I have that the police were pretty incompetent in terms of this case, so...
And there was also this nastiness of having respect for doctors who didn't deserve their respect. If you have a doctor who deserves respect, that, like some of the missionaries in Africa. Name one. Can you name a good missionary in Africa? A famous missionary doctor from the Congo?
I can't say I'm familiar.
Albert Schweitzer. Did you know that he was my pen pal, among others?
Was he really?
He invited me. He invited me to serve with him, but unfortunately, death took him from us. Later on, I met his successor. The successor was a nice young doctor from Belgium, but he couldn't do an organ recital and make $20,000. So La Barona was in financial straits because it didn't have the financial wherewithal.
Well, thank you so much for your help and your time this afternoon.
Well, what do you think about somebody like this patient, actually? She's not my patient, this Schulko person. What can be done? She's obviously sick. You know what? As a psychiatrist, I studied psychiatry, but I do not have the patience to be a psychiatrist. I know plenty about it. You have to deal with all kinds of stuff. This is something I choose not to.
I hope she can get the help she needs.
Don't bet on it. Because now it's a matter of her trying to justify herself, and that not to happen.
You don't think she's made a very convincing case, then?
She has just got a chronic case of obsessive neurosis.
Well...
She can't quite solve it. She may have contributed to the failure to solve it, the justice on the case of this 16-year-old girl who was probably a pretty bright girl, but she may have crossed somebody in the wrong way, and these things happen.
All right, then. Well, have a great afternoon, and thank you again for your time.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
We know when I had my answer for my last question, I don't want to be on the phone with you for another hour because you make me very uncomfortable and you're very obviously very unwell. So, but also like lonely old guy, right? Part of it is this need narcissist to just like charm everyone and talk about how wonderful they are, and then the other is just this very isolated old man who, in whatever strange way, like grateful to have someone to talk to for an hour on a weekday afternoon.
Arguing with strangers on the internet, not going out today because I'm feeling too upset.
I remember I was living with like a good family friend at the time, and after I'd done the interview, we were on the phone for just under an hour. I was like, hey, I'm pretty sure I interviewed a serial killer today. And she was like, here at my house? And I'm like, no, Mimi, no, of course not.
Arguing with strangers on the internet, not going out today because I'm feeling too upset. Arguing with strangers on the internet, and I'm winning, and I'm winning.
When Christine Rothschild walked out of Anne Emery Hall on the morning of May 26, 1968, she embarked on a morning walk that was never completed. It was interrupted. In some ways, it feels like the final chapter of the story of Chris's life and death is also unfinished and incomplete. And that, despite Linda Schulkel's decades-long quest to get answers, there are still things we would like to know. And I don't know about you, but I feel like somewhere, in some other dimension, maybe in heaven, Christine Rothschild is still out there under the street lamps and morning mist, walking and waiting for us to put the pieces together. Some answers lie in a police file in Madison, Wisconsin. I requested an interview with UWPD to ask them about the status of the case in hopes of getting some answers to specific questions. And I also asked if I could review the police file. I was declined because they say the case is still open and active and they can't tell us anything all these 56 years later. And I'm not alone. Anna Hansen at the Wisconsin State Journal has had the same frustrating experience.
We have actually worked with a Freedom of Information Act lawyer, and we draft up a letter sort of bringing in those Freedom of Information statutes in the Wisconsin legislature, and sort of noting that, that's not really a legally valid answer of we can't give you anything at all because of this open investigation. And there is that argument that law enforcement often employs that, any information could jeopardize the case. And of course, there is merit to that. But at the same time, as you mentioned, this case is, more than 50 years old. But we, sent that letter basically saying, that doesn't necessarily hold up. And they said that their response was that it would be an undue burden to get me those reports because it's something like 12,000 pages and, it'd be a lot. And so I then asked for an inventory list of the documents and reports that they have so that I could request specific ones. And it wouldn't be an undue burden to get, instead of all 12,000 pages to request this, this, and this. And my most recent feedback on that was them saying, we don't have an inventory list and we do not have to make one by law. So, I was speaking to that same lawyer the other day, and he said, that definitely is a story in and of itself that, since 1968, they've been working on this case and no inventory list exists. So there's the question of how they keep things organized with, I can't imagine how many, 12,000 pages of. So that's going to be part of the story for sure.
For now, this is the last episode of Season 10, but if there are any updates or if we get access to that police file, you can expect some update episodes. Meanwhile, we can find some solace and comfort in the many inspirational elements of this story, including the beauty of friendship, devotion, love, and the pursuit of healing. Because answers or no answers, good things have come from Linda's work. After the murder of her dorm mate, Sarah Surratt could not return to UW. She transferred to another school, and after college became a public defender.
I put bad experiences in a box in my head, and as time goes by, you close the lid, and you just don't open that lid very often as time goes by. And that lid was closed for a really, really long time until I heard from Linda some years ago. And, then you open the lid, and it actually was really good for me when Linda contacted me, and I was able to talk about it and express some things and some emotions that I think I needed to get out. I've had so many experiences since then, especially going into criminal law, and I've defended so many murders. And it's interesting because The question that everybody always has with murder is why? Why? And I've come to the conclusion that a lot of times there's just no answer. There is no why. It's just something that happened at the moment, a bad decision, a moment of anger, and there was a weapon there. And a lot of times there is no why.
I will let Dr. Lou Bernhard express what I imagine many of you are already thinking and feeling.
Without compromise, Linda Schilko should be recognized for her intense love of Christine, her friendship, and doing what she felt was right. And if she didn't pursue this, and I don't know, the only time I really met Linda was at the memorial. I don't know her, her social situation, their family. But it must have been at a great cost to pursue this. She really deserves a lot of credit.
In fact, Linda did not set out on this quest with the goal of someday writing a book about it. On the contrary, the book, it turns out, was a type of last straw for her.
My reason for writing the book was not to tell the world Chris's story. My reason for writing the book was so that I call them the players in Chris's death and investigation and so forth are properly identified, and they are accountable to themselves, not to the world necessarily, but to themselves for the role they played in frustrating the case so that it still remains cold today as far as its status. That was my last straw, basically, in what I had to do to kind of put the final chapter into the life of the problem. I'm still active. Anything I read about Chris or people write, I'm still responsive to it and so forth. But that was my own personal dedication to Chris. The story will be told as accurately, and the players fully identified, and the roles fully identified to the best of my ability after all these years of doing my very best research to find the truth.
And about that book, there is a lot in there that we were simply unable to get to in this podcast. I highly recommend that you order Linda's Kindle book, Murder on the 56th Day. You can get it on Amazon or use the links in the show notes. That's Murder on the 56th Day by Linda Schulko. Schulko is spelled Schulko. Thank you for joining me for this Season 10 rebroadcast on Thanksgiving Day of 2025. I'm thankful to have listeners such as yourself joining me here at Dakota Spotlight.